Your money can work way harder than you ever could. It works 24 hours a day. It speaks all language. It grows exponentially, like not linearly, exponentially. It can work way harder than you can. So get to the point where you become the manager of your money and eventually the CEO. Like, don't let it manage you. That's the hustling backwards. Like, you need to put that thing to work so that you can actually rest. You just have to realize, like, there's a limitation to being human. It's not going to be, you're going to get tired. And when you get tired, you want to have a financial plan that supports the laziest version of you the same way that it supports that hardworking, grinding version of you.
Welcome to 2 Decades Deep. This is a podcast where we are exploring the depths of our 20-somethings. I am here with Kiersten. I am so excited to talk to you. We've already kikied a little bit before this, but I'm just so excited to dive into this conversation. I think now more than ever, I've done some research on 20-somethings and finances, and the reality is we're making the most, we're getting all these degrees, yet we're not seeking financial freedom. And so you have a great testimony. You have a great story about how you were able to pay off debt. You have really dedicated your life to making sure other people have financial freedom. So I'm so excited to talk to you today.
The feeling is mutual. I'm excited that you care enough to be able to create a platform like this and allow these conversations that need to happen between people who are just a little bit ahead of you and can give you some game and tell you what it is. And, it goes both ways. I will also learn a lot from you in the conversation. So I'm excited.
Yes, and please put me on game because I'm struggling. So I just want to know a little bit about you, about your background, and how did you even end up in finance?
Yeah, it's a long, windy road, but basically my background is I'm a regular Black girl. I'm from Texas originally, but I grew up in Atlanta, and through life, my childhood was pretty normal. A 2-parent household, went to public school, did all the things, went to college, and the whole time that I was growing up, I was very interested in money, but I was only interested in the making and spending side of it. So I like to make money. I had entrepreneurial interests as a teenager. I would babysit, I would pet sit, I would make custom t-shirts, whatever it was. And then when I graduated, or when I was old enough to work, I got a job and I continued working. So I've been working since I was 13, 14, sometimes officially and sometimes unofficially. And I wasn't interested in the other aspects of finance. I was really just interested in cash flow. And it wasn't until I was knocking on 30 that I really started to understand the world of investing and personal finance and saving and all of the actual things that you're supposed to do with your money besides just acquire more things.
Yeah, let's dive into that, acquiring more things, because and I love what you talked about. I've always been in the money making world, but I never knew maybe how to invest it or how to actually utilize it. So what were your spending habits like in your 20s? I'd love to know. Can you walk me through what did that look like? What was your relationship to money in your 20s?
Yeah, I was loose with it. In my 20s, it was the early 2000s. And so, brunch culture, hip hop culture, I was in Atlanta. I was a former hot girl. I was out. And so every time I got money, I spent it. And so for a while, my jobs were in retail. So my early career was in retail. And so I was just surrounded by things that I could buy. And I ate out a lot. I did not cook at home. So almost every meal was prepared by somebody else, and that comes at a premium. I had lots of friends. I traveled. When I left retail, I joined a hospitality company, which meant I got employee rate at a bunch of different hotels. And so I was just on the road. There was no rhyme or reason to my spending habits other than I knew rent was due on the 1st. And so I needed to have a certain amount of money in my bank account. And other than that, it was just a hustle. It was more of just trying to make sure that I didn't have more month at the end of my money. So a lot of moving from the checking into savings, it's like that old Kevin Hart joke. A lot of hustle. It was very active at the time.
Yeah, I can relate to that currently. I feel like I know when my rent is due, I know when my insurance is due and all those things, but outside of that, I can spend a lot and a lot of money. And it's hard because, I want to live my life. Like I want to have fun similar to you. I'm in a sorority, so like I love my ships, my line sisters and hanging out, but the reality is I'm getting to the point where I'm realizing, wait, this isn't sustainable.
No.
Or I'm not seeing the fruits of my labor at work on the day to day. So from your perspective or from your experience, when did that shift happen where it's like, wait a second, I need to figure out how to regulate my finances?
Yeah, it was when I could no longer keep it a secret. So what happened was I met a boy who then became my husband, but I met this guy at work and we went on a trip within like 90 days of meeting each other. And we agreed that we would split the trip. This was before 50-50 was even a conversation. Like it was just the norm that you pay for your part and he pays for his part. And so we took this trip and I put it all on a credit card. Like I just did what I normally do, which is prepare to pay for it later. And so when we got back from the trip, I was ready to keep the party going. Like I'm a person who has a hard time with transitions. And so if I have a really fun 10-day vacation, the idea of coming back and then converting to like peanut butter sandwiches so that you can actually pay for the money you just spent, that was not a skill that I had. I was like, okay, we're back. Now where do you want to go for dinner? We should go for Thai because we just came back from somewhere. So like, and he had a reaction to that because at the time we were making the same amount of money and he was like, I don't understand like where this money is. How are you paying for all of this? Like I need to buckle down so that I can pay off this credit card in full at the end of the month. And I was like, where they do that at? Like, what are you talking about? And he had a very strong reaction and it led to him asking me how I was paying for this. And I explained credit cards. And he told me that if he had known that I had all this credit card debt, that he would have never dated me. And I was just like shook. Like, you go on a trip with a man for 10 days and then he comes back and the debt is the problem. Like, what? So I assumed it was something else and I was upset. Like I was embarrassed. I was frustrated. I never imagined that debt could be the kind of thing that would end a relationship. Like it was so normal to me. It's like breaking up with somebody because they're left-handed. Like, okay, I get everybody isn't left-handed, but like some people are. And so that breakup, and we eventually got back together because now we're married. But like that breakup was probably my first wake-up call because it led to me being curious. Like, what is so bad about it? And luckily, he was willing to, after a couple of weeks had passed and we had calmed down, he was willing to explain what the problem was and why it was not sustainable. Because in my mind, it was sustainable as long as I kept working. And no one had ever asked me, okay, but what if you don't keep working? Or what if your salary doesn't continue to grow at the rate that it has in the first 5-10 years of your career? And he was the first person that asked me those questions and made me confront the reality that we don't control that part. And so that's when I really got interested in finance.
Something that really stands out to me in that conversation, more than just like, okay, to keep a man, get in debt. No, I'm just kidding. No, but you're having these conversations at such a young age. And that's honestly, finance is not something that I hear on the day to day with my peers. And so I'm wondering, like, why are these conversations so hard to have? Or why was it so hard for you to take that?
Yeah.
Can you just kind of like walk me through that?
It's a lot of things. It's tied to our identity. We live in a consumerism culture. And so if you think about the US economy, 70% of it is based on consumer goods, like people consuming and buying more things. And so it's normalized. And unless you come from generational wealth where you have the margins to be able to do that forever and not have to work in order to keep up and pay off the things that you're buying, it leads you to a trap. And luckily, my husband, Julian, was well aware of that. He was raised in America, but his parents weren't. So his parents are from Jamaica. He was born in New York, grew up very differently than me, like almost the exact opposite. And so he had a very different understanding of what it takes to make it versus me, which was, I was just following the default script. I just assumed like, yeah, okay, well, I'll work for the next 40 or 50 years because I was still early in my career. And then eventually I was like, do I really have like 30 years in the tank? Like, just so I can have another purse or another jacket or another brunch? And when I started to be honest about that, and when he showed me an alternative, which was the financial independence, retire early movement, I was like, oh, I could be done in like 10 years. I could be done in 5 years. I could be done when I choose. And that freedom of choice was the thing that like really hooked me. But a lot of people don't have the alternatives to be able to have a productive conversation about money. Lots of conversations about money are just transactional, or they make people defensive because you want to know like, why did you do something? Or that was stupid. Versus like, here is all the things that you can do with your money. You can use it as a tool to improve the quality of your life. You can create a spectrum of emotions that aren't given to you by an employer. So things like fulfillment and freedom and just things beyond the ability to buy stuff. Those conversations don't happen because there aren't enough people who have had those experiences that are willing to talk about what's on the other side of just spending.
Yeah, I appreciate you being so candid about that. And we're going to talk a little bit about the like generational and the cultural ties to money and how that plays into how we show up financially a little later in the conversation. But and I want to talk about the retire early plan a little later as well. But let's hone in on this perspective change, because you talked about, you had a conversation with your husband, and it's one thing to hear things, it's one thing to be confronted with things, but it's another thing to actually change and create an action plan. So can you talk a little bit about how you shifted your mindset, or what are some tangible things that you started to do early on as you started to seek financial freedom?
Yeah, the first thing was finding other voices. And so, sometimes someone can tell you something, but it didn't need to come from them. And that was the case here. He was the catalyst or the spark for my curiosity, but I really needed to find other voices that I heard more neutrally. And so I subscribed to a bunch of podcasts. This was early when people were just creating podcasts, and financial enthusiasts were creating blogs and writing about their strategies on the internet in the early days before like monetization and all the stuff that we see now. And so I immediately started subscribing to different blogs. I listened to different podcasts. I immersed myself in it the same way that you would immerse yourself in learning a new language. And with that came lots of different stories, lots of different approaches. I didn't really feel locked into this rigid formula. I did at first, but then as I expanded, I learned that there are just a variety of ways that you can achieve whatever your goal is. And that was the game changer. And then from there, it was a lot of internal work. Like that was the external part, is making sure that I'm in the right environment to learn how to do this and to feel like it's possible. But then there was a lot of internal work to figure out, like, why do I keep buying things with money I don't have? I haven't even paid for, like, when you have debt, it means you haven't paid for something that you bought the last time. Like, I had to really do some reconciling and some honest, dialogue with myself to figure out, like, what is the psychology there? And, it wasn't easy. Like, it's not, I think people think that, you get some traction and you make some wins for the first 90 days, but those habits are ingrained. I had 20, almost 30 years of habits that I had to unlearn, and it took years. There's still parts that I'm still working on, but it was enough for me to build a plan that allowed me to see the wins early. I did the snowball method, paying off my debt. So I was knocking out cards. I was using windfall money. I broke my lease and moved into a tiny apartment on the unsexy part of town, like the unsexy side of town. I did all the things to make sure that I had cash flow so that I had cash flow to be able to pay off this debt as soon as possible.
Yeah, what you said, I think, is something that I'm currently in, where I'm looking towards several different perspectives on how to do money, because there's not a one size fits all. Everyone has different salary ranges, comes from different family, where some people get inheritance, some people don't. So it's really interesting to hear everyone else's perspectives. And what I appreciate about what you said is you had to make sacrifices. You're like, I moved to the unsexy part of town, and you had to just make really big sacrifices. So I know you're unlearning. You talked about unlearning habits. Can you explain a couple habits that you had to unlearn when you were seeking financial freedom initially?
Yeah, one of the habits was only thinking in the short term. Like, and it showed up in a number of ways. It could be something like, I don't know what I'm going to eat for dinner tonight. Or it could be, I don't know, when I'm going to buy this thing, but I don't know when I'll actually be able to pay it off. And so just stretching my thinking to think about like the thing after this step or this action was a habit that I had to build. It was so autopilot that I would just swipe, swipe, swipe versus actually thinking like, what is this costing me? It's a switch between can I afford it to at what cost? Because when you think about the cost of whatever you're buying versus just the price, then you start to realize like, oh, I don't actually need this. Like, this is going to cost me another month of debt, which means another month of not being able to invest or save or build up any cash cushion, another month of not being able to treat myself in the way that I want to, or set aside a budget for, expected expenses. And when I thought about that, when I learned how to do that, it changed my behavior slowly but surely. And I would start small, but eventually it just became a new habit that replaced the old one. And I think the second thing that I had to unlearn was my relationship with my career. I always assumed that I would out earn my spending. I had plans to be a VP, a CEO, whatever. Like, I just assumed that every year I would see more money than what I was spending. And that was always my plan. Like, oh, I'll pay off the debt when I get this promotion, or I'll pay off the debt when I get this bonus. And I had to unlearn that idea of having that much faith in an employer for my own personal goals. Like, an employer is a means to an end, but you are accountable. I am accountable for my personal goals. And that switch to accountability, like, I still fight it to this day, but it is one of the best returns you can make. There's usually no downside for taking more accountability in your life. And once you learn how to do that, you unlock so many things. And I think people underestimate what that means for your money.
That raises another point. So I listened to your podcast with your husband, and one of the podcasts that stood out to me the most is talking about wisdom versus just having this like drive to save money. And I too, so something that you talked about in the podcast, for those who have not heard about it, is this idea that, oh, when I'm older, I'll just naturally become more wise, or I'll naturally become more financial literate just because I'm just getting older and I'm experiencing more. But it really takes intentionality and a conscious effort. So can you talk a little bit about actually gaining knowledge? Because it's more than just like, okay, I'll start saving. I won't go to McDonald's today. I won't do that. But it really takes a level of intentionality.
It does. I'm so glad you said that. And thank you for listening. So my husband and I host a podcast called Rich and Regular. That's our brand. And we explore life at the intersection of money. So there are some podcasts that are just going to go straight direct to the point and tell you exactly what a 401k is. What we like to do is talk about all of the ways that 401ks will enrich your life and all of the ways that they can help you. So we start with life, and then we back into the money aspect. And so that episode with wisdom, it was really about addressing this idea that people like to white knuckle their way through. They like to grind it out. And that is not sustainable. You actually, and there's lots of research that shows this, that willpower is a depleting trait. There's not infinite amounts of willpower. And so what you have to do is start to lean on wisdom, start to lean on the lessons that you learn, and let those be the building blocks for whatever insight that you're trying to have. And so I forgot the question.
I was, no, you were killing it though.
I was like, I could keep going, or I could just check to make sure that I understood the question.
Well, just with wisdom or financial literacy, and if you can also please explain what financial literacy is. We've been bouncing that word around, but people may not know what that is. But it's one thing to have this drive to save money, but it's another thing to actually gain knowledge or gain wisdom when it comes to finances. So can you explain what financial literacy is? And then can you just walk me through what that looks like and how to attain financial literacy?
Yeah, it's a word that I've struggled with for a while because people treat it as the end all be all. Like it is the answer to everything. When people make financial mistakes, it's because they're financially illiterate. And the reality is a lot of people who are making financial mistakes aren't financially illiterate. They are just choosing to do something different. They know that they're supposed to save money. If you poll your audience right now, 90% of them will be like, yeah, I heard I was supposed to save money. Like very few of us by this point have not heard that we're supposed to save money, avoid debt, do all the things. That's a form of literacy. But there are levels, right? There's a spectrum to literacy just like there is in any other fashion. You can have a third grade reading level or you can have a 12th grade reading level. And the same is true for financial literacy. But we treat it like it's a one and done thing. Like we treat it like a driver's license. Like I only had to take the test once and now I can just drive. And that's not the case with financial literacy. You should be reevaluating your literacy levels at every milestone in your life. And so in your 20s, there's a literacy level that just starts with the foundational aspects of creating a budget that you can rely on, that is actually working for you, learning to invest and starting the accounts, creating a savings plan, all of those things. And then when you move into your 30s, and it's not to say, I don't want to generalize because some people start life a lot earlier, but you start thinking about family and estate planning and raising children and healthcare and all of the other things that come with aging. And so it's an ongoing practice, it's an ongoing skill. But once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? It works very similarly to reading, where it's like if you look at a group of letters, you're reading them. Like once you learn how to read, it no longer looks like just random letters. You can't help but to read because that's what you do when you see letters. The same is true for financial literacy. When you understand the game, you can't help but see things for what it is. And that skill helps you navigate this stuff without so much willpower and effort. It becomes effortless. Like you just look at something and you're like, I can't afford that. That's outside my budget. Like I can't. That's a no for me. I'll find an alternative. And that, I think when people ask questions, they haven't gotten to that point yet. And they're asking like, but how do I say no? And it's like learning how to read. Eventually it comes. You need to immerse yourself and get more literate, reach another level of literacy so that becomes automatic because you know that it's not good for you.
That's so good. And I even think about I love that analogy talking about like learning how to read. And I was even thinking of it's like with my physical health and my fitness goals. And then you talked about level of accountability. And so at first it's like, okay, my back isn't going to unbig by itself. Like, I need to do things. So, and then eventually, you're like, okay, I'm not going to eat that. Or no, I need to go to the gym. I need to make those sacrifices because I know the long-term effects. And speaking of the long-term effects, something that is outstanding that you and your husband did was pay off over $200,000 of debt. Yeah. I need you to explain the story and tell me what tangible steps did you all take to attain that?
Yeah, it's interesting. We paid off, and it feels like so long ago, but it wasn't. It took us 5 years to do it, but it wasn't linear. Like it wasn't so clean as like, oh, okay, 200 divided by 5, we paid off $40,000 a year. It wasn't like that. It was like a exponential curve, because to your point about the fitness thing, like you may start with saying, okay, I got to get my butt in the gym. I can't eat that. But eventually your body decides for you and tells you like, you can't eat that. Like I am going to react if you eat that because you've trained it. Eventually your body says we need to get up and move because that's what we do. The same is true with debt. People underestimate how much your brain changes once you start that journey. And so for us, we started with the little things. We tried to eliminate recurring costs. So we cut the cord well before there were all these streaming services and all that jazz. We cut the cord. We got an over-air antenna, which they still make. It's not the rabbit ears anymore. It's like a sleek little thing, but you can still get free basic cable. We cut the cord, we ate more at home, we changed our vacation style, lots of rewards points, lots of road trips. We said no to certain friends and family, which, is still hard to reconcile with. Like we missed some key events because we had a goal. And most importantly, we were talking about it frequently. Like it was a weekly thing that we were talking about. As soon as the check hit, we would move the money to where it was supposed to go and live off what's left. And so we organized our lives around the goal instead of like expecting the goal to organize itself around us. And it was a total shift, but it was a 5-year commitment. And I always tell people that we overestimate what's possible in 1 year, but we underestimate what's possible in 5. And so that last year was when we powered through a lot of it in this last 18 months or so, which was our mortgage. And so we committed to paying off the mortgage. We had done a remodel on our house because we wanted to, on his house. I moved in with him after we got married, after we got engaged. And then we did a remodel because we wanted to stay small. Like the narrative is that once you get a wife, once you get married, you're supposed to get like your big house together. And we decided that we would make his 1980s built condo work. We would invest in a renovation and cash flow that, like pay it off, don't acquire any more debt. And then we would turn to the mortgage and pay all of that off. And so that's what we did. And it's amazing when I look at the 5-year span and compare the first 3 years and what we paid down to the last 2 years, just because as you're going and as you're giving yourself those raises by knocking off your debt, you get more confident in other areas of your life. Like when you don't owe nobody nothing, the way you show up to work, the way you show up to different moments in life is just very different. And we saw the rewards of that. Like it wasn't just that our salary stayed the same. We also got promotions during that time. We made better use of windfall money. So those months where you get an extra check, or if you get like a surprise rebate in the mail, like we made use of all of that, and it became habit so that by years 4 and 5, it was like, oh man, this is easy. And so, yeah, that's how we did it. It was a lot of sacrifice up front, but then when you give yourself the room for your brain to change, for your mindset to change, you just keep going. You don't stop.
I love that when you give yourself the freedom to or the space to keep going and to be gracious to yourself. Because you said it wasn't linear. Like it wasn't like, okay, yeah, let's just divide and conquer. But it really took a level of accountability, saying no, sacrifice, all the things. So I think that's really important. And thank you for saying it the way you did. We're going to play a little game. And it's called Let's Go Deeper, where you do have the opportunity to dive in or hone into things that really do affect all things finances.
Okay.
And I even asked a couple of my friends, because I'm like, okay, I know what affects me, but what affects a lot of 20-somethings? So let's start here. So according to the Bureau of Labor, the average American, this is in 2023, the average American made around $59,000. And depending on where you live, depending on your cost, depending on what, like if you're a caregiver, etc., that may or may not be a lot of money. So some people feel like I don't earn enough to save. I'd love to know your thoughts on that. Is that a thing? No. Or
it can be if you choose. Like, welcome to the land of the free. You are welcome to make it a thing, but it really shouldn't be. You have to get in the habit of paying yourself first. You have to save first. A lot of people try to do it on the back end, and to that extent, you don't have enough money. But if you commit to shaving off, $100 of every check or $25 of every check, whatever it is, to yourself first, you never even see it. So you don't have the option to spend it. It's there waiting for you. And so you have to back into it. And I think the other thing is that you have to find partnerships. And when people hear that, they think romantic, like, oh, I'm telling you to get a boo. And it's like, no, you need a partnership, because the game that you're playing in capitalism in America is not a one-player game. It's not a single-player game. It's a multiplayer game across the board. And so if you don't have different partnerships, whether it's a business partner or a friend that you can do a group cell phone plan on, or a homie that has a Costco membership and y'all go together and split everything in bulk, you have to have people that are willing to help you. If you try to do it alone, there is no right amount of money. Like there's very, very few people make enough money to try to do it without any sort of community subsidy. And so you really have to think through where you can find those key partnerships. And again, I'm not talking about romantic, and we're not even talking about like money exchanging. It could just be when next time you need a toolkit, a screwdriver, you reach out to your friends first. Next time you need a blazer, you go to you join a buy nothing group in your neighborhood and see if anybody has one, or you go, get it secondhand. It just changes the way that you think about how you interact with the world, because we live in a very abundant, very wealthy country. And I think we've been taught to be so individualistic that, yeah, I understand why people don't feel like they have enough. But I'm telling you, if you start that at $59,000, when you get to $120,000, you still gonna feel like it's not enough. It's people who make $250,000 who feel like it's not enough. I watched a reel the other day. It was a young lady in her 20s. She makes $300,000 a year because she owns her own company and she pays herself like a CEO. But she did her monthly budget. She got $18,000 and she spent $17,600 of it. And it's like, so she's still left with $400. People who make $50,000 have the same $400. Like, if you don't have a purpose for your income, and we talk about this in our book, Cashing Out, then it doesn't matter how much you make. You just have to get into the habit of paying yourself first.
Yeah, and you answered one of my next questions, just about like, okay, when I make more, can I spend more? And you're essentially, I mean, you could, but the reality is, if you're not intentional about where you're putting your money or where you're saving your money, you could end up in the same boat. Right. And that's something that I have to constantly remind myself. And you said a little earlier in the conversation, I always assume like, oh yeah, like in 5 years when I make this amount of money, like I'll be fine. It's like, no, you got to worry about what's happening right now, because you don't know what's in the future.
You don't.
And so I appreciate you saying like, no, you actually can save no matter how much you're making. You have to pay yourself first. Yeah. So thank you for talking about that, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I don't want to act as if I don't understand that there are people who literally do not make enough money. That's a different situation. If you're financially insecure, you still have to find, partnerships. It might be government subsidized partnerships, but you still have to do that work to make sure that you put your own mask on first. Because I'll tell you what, if you don't have any sort of cushion, whether it's $100 or $1,000, it gets real violent. Like, this is the kind of country that will let you live on the street. Like, they don't care. And so no one is going to care more than you. And this is not a matter of me not being sympathetic to other situations. It's just a reminder that, like, there are helpers out there. You have to find them so that you can allow yourself to care.
Yeah. And when I first started in my early careers, when I moved to DC, I moved without a job, but then thankfully I got a job shortly after that. I had to live with my family. I was looking into, I live in DC, so I looked into the Inclusionary Zoning Act, where they give affordable housing. And you don't realize that there's a lot out there until you need it. And so I appreciate you saying like, no, there's resources. Like, maybe we can get ahead of this. And I'm even thinking through my friends in DC, how we can actually share the wealth and share, like, I have a Costco card, like I can give that to them, and yeah. Costco's everything, by the way.
Costco is everything.
Yeah, literally has everything. But yeah, so I think that that's really important. Something also that I want to talk about as an early careers woman is 401k. We hear this all the time, but I don't think a lot of people know exactly what it is. So one, can you explain what a 401k is? And then also, can you just talk about, is that the best way to save in the workplace?
Yeah, I'll give you the Kiersten definition, which is the 401k is the government's incentive program for you to actually save for your future self, because they're not going to do it, right? That's that. But it is the scientific or clinical definition is that it's an investment account that is meant for retirement. And so with that comes rules around when you can withdraw from it without penalty. And those rules are set at, oh gosh, I can't remember. I think it's 65 or 62 at this point. I can't keep the standard retirement date in my head because I stopped believing in it a long time ago. But that is the point where you can withdraw from your 401k without paying a early withdrawal penalty or any sort of other penalty. But basically, it allows you to save money tax-free, invest money tax-free that grows on your behalf. And the idea is that if you start it when you're 20 at the beginning of your career and you commit to investing consistently over time, by the time you are 60, 65, you are a millionaire because of compounding and because of the way that you invest. Now, the question about whether it's the best way, this is It depends, which is the answer to 99% of finance questions. It depends on the 401k offering that your employer has. Some employers will partner with a provider that doesn't offer the best, lowest cost, most efficient investments. So a lot of people think that their 401k gives them direct access to the stock market, and it doesn't necessarily. Some of them do, but sometimes it might just be what Charles Schwab or Fidelity or your employer has decided they want to offer you as an employee. So you don't have full access. Two, it depends on if you have an employer match. An employer match is an incredible gift because it's 100% return on your investment, which doesn't happen anywhere else. It's not free money because it does require you to do something, but you get 100% return because for every dollar you put in, they put in another dollar. And so you really should think about it as an extension of your compensation package. They're telling you that we will give you this money, up to 2% of your salary, and all you need to do is this thing, and a lot of people still don't do it. I was one of those people. I didn't take advantage of my match for like 5 years. And I look back, and it was a huge mistake because it would have been 100% return, and it was part of my salary. They had set it aside for me, and I didn't do what was required. And then the third thing that I would say when you're considering whether it's good for you is what your goals are. And so for people who are entrepreneurial or who may want access to their investments earlier, there are a lot of ways that you can invest outside of your employer through like a brokerage account. The incentives are not there, so it's not tax-free, like you have to pay, you're investing post-tax dollars, but you don't have the restrictions on when you can draw down. And so you can do the same thing where you're investing on a regular basis over 40 years, but instead of waiting until you're 65, you can draw down at 35 when you're ready to buy a house, or when you are just needing to take a break from work, or whatever the case is, you can use that money throughout your life. And so we did a combination of both. Our traditional retirement is in a 401k. We don't plan on really accessing that until we're of age. And then we have this brokerage account, which is what we play with. Play with is we don't play with it, but like that is where, you know, our money is, that if we need anything before then, that's where we can access it.
And something you mentioned a little earlier was the FIRE plan. Can you talk a little about it? So what is it? Financial.
Let me just
explain it.
So FIRE is an acronym for Financial Independence, Retire Early. It is a group of money enthusiasts who figured out that you don't need to work for 40 years if you can have an increased savings rate earlier. So instead of saving 10 to 15% for 40 years, if you save 40 or 50% for 10 or 15 years, you get the same outcome, but much earlier in life. And from there, you have the ability to choose whether you go to work. A lot of people hate on the FIRE movement because in the early days, people would hit that number and decide like to never work again. Like they created a goal that allowed them to quit and never earn another dollar. Like it was that much money. Now there's more of a spectrum where people are allowed to define financial independence for them. And so maybe your goal is to never ever, like maybe your goal isn't to never ever work again. Maybe your goal is just the ability to pick and choose where you work. Like for me, the goal was to be able to be picky. I wanted to afford to be able to be picky. And I can be picky now. Like I can decide when I want to work, when I want to make money, when I want to relax. I own my time. That was my personal definition of financial independence, and that's what we teach in Cashing Out. But when I found it, it was a game changer because I had just never questioned retirement. I had never questioned the definition. I had never questioned the age. And this movement or this strategy for personal finance was the only one that I saw that took in the new information about how our economy works, that you can, work from a laptop, that you can earn internet money, and applied it to a financial plan. All of the other ones were like, you pay off your mortgage, you still work, you do all this stuff, debt freedom is king, versus this one, which allowed more flexibility and allowed me to kind of make it my own. And so I wasn't immediately drawn to it. At first I was like, these people are weird. Like they're super frugal. Because at that time, people were super frugal. They were doing things like, splitting the ply on their toilet paper to save money. Like it's changed quite a bit. But at the time, there were definitely extreme examples of what people were doing to like be super hyper efficient with their savings rate. Once we figured out our rhythm and I figured out like how we wanted to do it, it was a no-brainer, and it still is. Like I still ask every young person to consider a world where your career is only 15 years, right? Like by the time you're 35, you have enough money to be able to decide what you want to do. And you don't have to wait until you're 20 to start investing. I read an article from Fidelity the other day that more teens are investing now than ever before. You can start investing. My son is 7 and he invests. When he has birthday money, when he gets Christmas money, I mean, we do it on his behalf, like clearly. We're the custodials of his account, but he won't have to wait until he's 35. Like if he continues what we've created for him, he can be financially independent by the time he's 28 and decide whatever he wants to do, where you want to live, what you want to work for somebody else or you want to do it for yourself. So it's a life that leads to more options. And again, like I think that is the feeling of options at every stage gate that a lot of Black and brown people just haven't experienced yet. Our family didn't get to experience it. We are signing ourselves up for a world where we don't get to experience it, and then we pass it on to our children and they don't get to experience it. Meanwhile, their peers are born into that, right? Like there are people in my space that were born into it, and I'm like, man, I can't imagine if I had known what I knew now at your age, because I'd be in a totally different position.
Yeah, which brings up, there's so many questions I have from what you just said, but let's talk a little bit about this cultural tie to money. And you talked a little about that, like in the past or older generations, maybe they didn't have the opportunity to seek financial freedom. And that does get passed down because knowledge is power. And what you know, you can pass on. So can you just talk about the importance of that? And also because it gives you a sense of grace when you realize like, wait, we didn't know.
Yes.
So can you talk about that?
Yeah, there's two variables. We didn't know and we weren't allowed. Like if you are a woman, the history of being allowed to have a credit card or being allowed to acquire an asset without a man is very short. Like you have to remember, our country is still young relative to these other dynasties that have been around for thousands of years. Like our country is like 400 and something years old, and 200 plus of that was slavery, where we were working for free. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? Like we're playing catch up, and there are systemic barriers that prevent that. Like even though they remove some of the legal barriers, there are still a lot of social and cultural ones because of the habits and the way that this country runs. And so there's an aspect of acknowledging that comes into your motivation for pursuing this plan. But I'll tell you where there are very few barriers, and that's in investing, right? Not talking about real estate because that's its own thing, but in the stock market, a dollar is a dollar. Like I ain't never heard somebody say I got less returns because I was Black. You invest, those dollars are distributed evenly. And so that's a game we can win. And it requires us to, again, approach literacy at different stages of our lives, because our parents may not have done it, because back in the day when they were investing, when they were employed, it was very difficult to get into the stock market. If you wanted to open a brokerage account, like I mentioned to you, you needed to have like $25,000 up front. You needed to be able to walk into a bank building. There was a transaction fee. You had to have like a person. Like it was very labor intensive. After the financial crisis of 2008, what happened was a lot of the regulations removed the middleman. And so what it gave is consumers the ability to be their own banker. Apps, the ability to, if people use like Robinhood or whatever app you're using, that didn't exist prior to 2008. Like that capability for you to just invest on your phone instantly, as little as $1 before, like the same way you would open a Spotify account. It didn't exist. That's fairly new technology. And so now here we are in 2024, where it's gotten better, it's gotten cheaper. The big traditional institutions have gotten involved. And so you can do it with Fidelity, Vanguard, Charles Schwab. There are robo-advisors that you can use that manage that money for you. But if you don't know that, you still think that you need all of this money to invest. And it's like, you really don't. Like you really can start with as much as as little as you want. You don't even have to buy a whole share anymore. Like I don't recommend buying individual shares, but like you don't you can buy a fraction of a share. You want to own a piece of Nvidia or a piece of Tesla, put $10 on it. That's possible today. That was not possible, gosh, even 10 years ago. And so keeping up with how easy it's gotten and realizing that you might be the person standing in your way. You don't need any permission to open these accounts. They don't check your credit. Like, you just need the ability to, and the willingness and the motivation to actually do it. And when you confront that with yourself and say, why am I not doing this? Like, that's where you'll find the answers.
Yeah. And I appreciate you saying, like, you don't need permission. You can, and like, investment is not a barrier to your race or to your background. So I think that's really important to highlight. I have a few more for you, and then I want to talk about rich and regular and cashing out. But something that you mentioned is credit. And I've heard a lot of conflicting viewpoints about, keeping an outstanding balance on your credit ultimately is beneficial. But then I also hear people like, no, you need to pay that off. And so don't even touch your credit card. So what is that balance, or what can we do with that? Because I'm confused.
Yeah, it really depends on your understanding of your own psychology. So at the end of the day, credit is using other people's money. And depending on your credit worthiness, your credit score, that's your financial reputation, and that's what determines how much it costs you to use other people's money. And so if you take care of that, you can get access to other people's money at really cheap rates where it makes more sense to use theirs versus using yours. If you can get a home at 3% interest rate, that makes way more sense than, buying it at 9 or 10% or whatever it is. And so the idea around maintaining a credit score is around how dependent you want to be on using other people's money to do the things that you want to do in your life. I do see a lot of people holding on to unnecessary debt, not realizing how it impacts their future opportunities. At the same time, I also recognize that our credit scoring system is quite outdated. Like, it's fairly new, first of all. It's only been around, very similar to the 401k, like 50 something years. Like, it's time to update it. And there are a lot of fintech companies that are working on introducing other variables. So let's say if you have student loans, which will drastically affect your debt to income ratio, which is currently like a third of the score. If you have that, how can you counterbalance that with the fact that you've never missed a rent payment? You've never missed a car payment. Like, those are the things that are not included on your credit report today. Your ability to pay things on time that aren't credit, like, that are just other recurring bills. And so there are some fintech companies that, it feels promising, that are working on solutions that give alternatives to the traditional credit score. But in the interim, you have to recognize the game that you're playing and whether you want to win it or not. And so it's not something that you should ignore. It's not something that you should fixate on, because I see that a lot too, where people fixate on it and they'll pay off a bill and they'll see their credit score drop and then they freak out and they're like, I shouldn't have done that. And it's like, no, you still should. It's going to go back up. Like, it's a moving target. It's not like this static thing. It will go back up once it recalibrates. But it just highlights the outdatedness and the flawed approach of the rating score now. And so, I think the balance is 1 foot in, 1 foot out, like recognizing its importance, but not fixating to the point where it's detrimental to your other goals.
Yeah, and I'm loving this conversation because you're recognizing that there are gaps. You're recognizing that this is new. And so there's a lot of things that we're figuring it out as the country's figuring it out.
Yeah.
And so that's made me feel a lot better, because I feel like there's so much information and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I feel so behind. But the reality is like, wait, this is so new. Like, we're all figuring it out. So thank you. Yeah. Thank you for that.
That's a really important point, because like, somebody should create a podcast called like 2 Centuries Deep, where they work through what the United States 2 centuries in past slavery is trying to figure out. Like, if you really think about it, that we've only had like a tiny amount of time to create these systems and incentives and respond to what people want. Yeah, like, and on top of that, like, our politicians have been in place, the same families or the same people for like 70 or 80 of them years. Like we have not fully disrupted. We don't even have a third political party yet. Like we don't even have, there's so much we don't have yet. And so, yes, acknowledging that our economy is also in transition, and with the emergence of AI and with the emergence of all of this technology that we're talking about, there's going to be some things that are shifting, but you want to make sure you're on the right side of that, because a lot of people don't know what it feels like to be left behind versus like the beneficiary of the changes that you're making, right? It requires that long view, and more of us need to realize that like the country gonna move on whether you with it or not. It's with you or without you energy. That's the place that we're in. We're not in a like communal country. It's capitalism. It's violent. Like it's with you or without you. And so you want to be on the with you side, right? You want to, as best as you can, like don't hold on to old narratives that you know aren't working, but also don't set yourself up to believe in something that you haven't seen a lot of evidence for yet either. You have to be aware and go back to those check-ins, go back to that inner work, be accountable. Like, okay, I did this, I believe this, but how did it work out for me? Because that's the way you determine whether you're doing the right thing, is through the outcome or the result that you get.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people that are going to watch this or listen in on this episode are going to realize this is a very holistic journey. It's more than just saving, but it takes the psychology, it takes accountability, it takes community. It's a lot. And then my last question, just for the let's get deeper, is you talked about in your past, I talked about now, like we kick it. We like to be outside. We like to hang out. And so like, what's the balance with going out, having fun, enjoying your life? Because I don't think that, like, I think Dave Ramsey talks about like, just don't spend, or just very, very, very like, no, don't spend. But and that's not realistic.
No.
And people are looking to find meaning in their lives outside of work, outside of sacrifice. So what is that balance, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I'm definitely not on the Dave Ramsey train. I think Dave said, if you have debt, the only time I want to see you in a restaurant is if you're working there. And I was like, Dave, that's ridiculous. Like, come on, man. But I think the I don't know, like balance is a concept that just, it's a fluid moving target. Like you're always balancing. And so
Yeah.
I think the keys though are to revisit the things that make us human. Like it's to revisit vulnerability and courage. And if you really care about these relationships the way that you say you do, you can be vulnerable with your friends and say, I want to be outside, but we need to do it within the constraints of this dollar amount, or we need to pre-drink, or we need to sneak it in, or we need to look on Groupon for something that we can do, or we need to, whatever. I think the trend is called loud budgeting on TikTok, but I'm not on TikTok. But I've heard, and I was excited to see that more young people were willing to be honest about their situation, because you're not alone. Like if that's the average, if $59,000 is the average, that means 50% of people make more and 50% of people make less. So in any given friend group, like I don't know if you're the average. You could be broke Bobby or whatever that meme was, but you can realistically expect that if it's not that friend group, there is a friend group out there for you, a like-minded friend group that doesn't mind adding a layer of financial responsibility to your shenanigans. And for the shenanigans that you don't want to add that to, then you just plan for them. Like my friends and I are doing a big group trip in November for our birthdays, and we started talking about it in December. And so now you've given people an 11-month timeline. I had one friend who sent me a private text, and she's like, hey, I'd really like it to stay under this if possible. Can you just keep me posted as you're uncovering, where things might get expensive, so at least I can prepare for it. That's real friendship. That's real relationship. We are more willing to talk to our partners about our sexual exploits and all the other things that we do than what actually affects our day-to-day lives. And that has to change. And I think your generation and the generation before or after you is well suited, because at least they've had internet access. They've had people who are sharing their stories, and they know that there's a variety of flavors out there.
Yeah, I do love this like honesty movement and being more vulnerable, and it's because of social media, right? Like we've grown up in the platform where we're hearing people's day to day, and that wasn't always accessible. So I do think that that's like a really cool part of this digital world that we're moving in. There's a lot of downsides to
There
it, but there's a lot
is.
of positives too. Yeah, that's another podcast.
That is another podcast.
Well, I appreciate you playing that game. I think that we gained a lot of understanding just about some of the high level things about money. I do want to go into Rich and Regular to round up this conversation. You and your husband started Rich and Regular. Can you explain what that is and what was your motivation? It's one thing to be like, okay, we've received financial freedom and we understand it, but it's another thing like, wait, we want to pass this on. So what was the motivation for that?
Yeah, at the time it was our excitement for what we had found. Like we had really immersed ourselves in the personal finance space, and we would share that stuff. Like we were not gatekeeping. We would post it on Facebook like, oh my God, look at this article. But no one would react to it. Like I could post a picture of puppies that look like chicken fingers and I'd get 100 likes or shares or whatever it is on Facebook. But I would post an article about money and there would be like absolutely nothing. And I think at the time it was because the message was primarily led by white males on the West Coast or white women. Like it was very white at the time, just speaking honestly. And people couldn't relate to the messenger. Like they saw the messenger and they'd be like, oh, okay, that's like X Games, like cool for you, but like that's not what we do. And so we knew that we needed to contribute to the story. And so we created Rich and Regular, which was really just the culmination of our goal. Like it was before aesthetics were a thing, but if I think about it now, like it was the OG aesthetic. When I thought about who I wanted to be, if I was not concerned about, you know, a career or like the essence of who I wanted to be was Rich and Regular. It's the only thing better than being rich and famous was just like, I can still go to Target. I can still walk around the street. There's no paparazzi outside. But like I get the benefits of having that freedom to do what we want. And so we started documenting our journey back in 2017. We started as a blog where we would just post, you know, stories about supporting a financially insecure parent or preparing for our first child, acquiring real estate investments and then selling them because we're like, we're not really real estate investors. I don't like it. So it's the journey of our story. It became a podcast and then it became a book called Cashing Out, where we kind of, after we left our corporate jobs, we look back and we're like, there's a formula to this. And how do you package that up in a way that gives people the permission, I'm using permission, but you don't need it, like gives people the story, the lines, the rationale in a really concise way. And that's kind of been our journey. Like we've had a lot of fun creating it, and it's led to incredible opportunities that I could not have imagined.
Yeah, let's talk about Cashing Out for a little bit. So you kind of explained high level what it's essentially about, but what do you hope people gain from this book?
Yeah, I think the main lesson, well, I guess there's two things. One, you can't talk about money without talking about work. And so you meet a lot of finance books that give you tons of financial advice, but aren't telling you how to navigate the career space and how to think about the income that you earn from an employer differently in order to accomplish your goals. So that was the first thing, was to combine the two topics in a meaningful way. And the second thing was really for people like us who come from a legacy of hard workers, people who take pride in their work, people who pass on the message that you have to work twice as hard to get half as much. We wanted that audience to understand that your money can work way harder than you ever could. It works 24 hours a day. It speaks all language. It grows exponentially, like not linearly, exponentially. It can work way harder than you can. So get to the point where you become the manager of your money and eventually the CEO. Like, don't let it manage you. That's the hustling backwards. Like, you need to put that thing to work so that you can actually rest. At the end of the day, as much pride as we have in our work ethic, the reality is you can't do it forever. Like, you can't beat a robot for sure. Like, even people who thought they had some sort of longevity or, you know, some sort of secret sauce, some battery in their back, they're looking at AI like, oh, I can't do that. Like, I can't read a book cover to cover in 3 minutes and tell you the highlights of you can't do that. So at some point you realize that, like, you want to be on the side where your money is the thing that's working, because your money can do that. It can go into those spaces and at least punch above its weight versus what you can. You just have to realize like there's a limitation to being human. It's not going to be, you're going to get tired. And when you get tired, you want to have a financial plan that supports the laziest version of you the same way that it supports that hardworking, grinding version of you.
That's so good. Yeah. I was like, not you calling me out, because I do feel like I'm a robot. Like I could do anything.
You can't do that.
Not
Chat
quite.
GPT will humble everybody. It's like, can you do that? Can you do it in Spanish? Can you do it in Japanese?
Yeah. I went on a run not too long ago, and my knee was hurting. I'm like, whoa, this is different. Aging is something.
It is. It's just starting to. Lord, girl. That's a different podcast, too.
We may need a series, y'all. We may need a series. Well, I'll make sure that I link cashing out in the description. And I appreciate you so much just walking through the holistic approach to money and honestly giving people hope that we actually can obtain steps to financial freedom, and we can actually have accountability and do this in a community way. So I think that's awesome. My last question for you, something that I love that you talked about with the financial diet, is these windows of opportunity. So can you just talk about, we're in our 20s, what are some woos or windows of opportunities we can attain right now to start obtaining financial freedom or to make the right budget?
Yeah, I did a commercial spot for the financial diet. And I introduced this concept that I call woo moments, windows of opportunity, where these moments where if you make a choice, it has outsized returns, right? And at the time we were talking about life insurance. Like if you can buy life insurance in your 20s when you are presumably healthy, or at least you get added to a risk pool that is presumed to be healthy, because insurance math is different. But if you buy insurance in your 20s, it's like $10. Like it's super, super cheap. And that window of opportunity, because as you age, you get added to different risk pools, which makes it more expensive. That pays in dividends because you locked into that price. Like it's not like rent where it could be, but most times it's not like rent where it increases every year. Like you're locked in at an early age. So I think that's one of them. I think creating an investing habit is another one. So even in the investing world, it's called dollar cost averaging, but it's just regular investments into the stock market, into index funds or mutual funds, whatever you decide to invest in. That's something that you should start in your 20s, because the window of opportunity of 20 years of untouched growth is very different than if you start at 40, because at 40 life comes at you fast and differently, and the expenses are set up differently. And so if you can start that habit, and it's something that you just do, no different than brushing your teeth or flossing, like it's just hygiene, you set yourself up to be a millionaire. It stops being a goal. Like that's what I want for 20 somethings, is for becoming a millionaire to no longer be a goal, but to be seen as inevitable, because it's just what happens. It's just what happens. If you put your money into this thing consistently, it's an outcome, whether you're smart or not, whether you're pretty or not, whether you're like, it happens. Like that's just what happens. And so when you think of it as that way, you can focus your goals on other things, because the money is coming. Like I'm already doing that. So now I can create goals that are more aligned to my strengths, that aren't just chasing what I've seen online or what I saw somebody else have success with. I can do the things that I want to do without pressure for them making me this like seven-figure entrepreneur or whatever, because like you already got that. The stock market is going to make you that.
Yeah, that's so good. And yeah, this conversation was just so helpful, and I'm excited for 20-somethings to listen in, because it really does give us hope, and it gives us the understanding of, okay, at least I have some sense of direction on where to start. So I thank you so much for this conversation. It was so much fun talking to you. It felt like a kiki.
I know. It did.
So I appreciate you so much, and I'm going to drop all your information in the description so people know where to follow Rich and Regular.
Thank you. It was really fun.